So, Lothlorien, the last of the elven factions that we have to look at within Third Age Reforged, and indeed the last of the elven factions there will be, even if you include the half and halves like Dorwinion. And as with any elven faction, of course, Lothlorien do have a rich and varied history, mostly told between some of their more important figureheads within the faction, some of which are mentioned by name in some of the units that we will get onto a little bit later on. But we're more interested in what the Elves of the Golden Wood have to offer from a military perspective, and they of course share some of the same touchstones that their fellow elven factions do, but as with the other three, they go about their business with their own hints, really, in terms of what they're all about, and they certainly have a pretty distinct identity even among the elves, I would say, when it comes to what they're good at, and, well, what they're bad at is fairly similar to another elven faction, but we'll get onto their weaknesses a bit later on. We shall start off with what they are good at, and the first strength that I would mention, really, the thing that really does set Lothlorien apart even among the elves, is they have very high damage dealing units, this is both melee and ranged. They of course have some of the best lineup of offensive archers that the game has to offer, still with the same potential downsides when it comes to trading back and forth with the opposition as the other elves have. Because of their lower numbers, they can be overwhelmed if you're not built just so, even against factions that don't have the same sort of quality that Lothlorien have. You do need to be a little bit careful in that regard, but when it comes to just putting a bunch of damage down range, their long range options are still very, very strong. But they really back this up with having closer support units, mostly in the shape of axe throwers, which really does give Lothlorien a different element to them when you compare them to the others. Even Linden, but they're a little bit more javelin focused, whereas Lothlorien have the higher base damage of the axes. And Lothlorien also have probably the biggest damage dealing angle in melee, purely because they also dip in a little bit more to armor piercing than some of the other elven factions, and in fact that is what I would say as their second strength, and that is their armor-piercing options. Just having a more varied selection of units in this regard is something that the other elves don't really have. I mean, like we said, Linden do have the javelins, and it's not as if they're completely absent armor-piercing, the other elves, but Lothlorien have probably the most easy-to-access options when it comes to this sort of thing. Especially in melee, you would have to say. The fact that they have an armor-piercing shock infantry unit, a dedicated one, is something that the other elves simply don't possess, and it's the sort of thing which can really give them the extra damage-dealing boost against armor-centric factions. And considering Lothlorien don't skimp in terms of their baseline stats either, it just gives them that really good effectiveness against even those factions which can try and outlast the elves through sheer defensive acumen. With Lothlorien that's harder to do because they're going to have the options to really punish most types of units en masse, and the armor piercing is one of the main facets of that. We've mentioned in a few of the faction overviews that have passed that armor piercing and a vulnerability to it is many factions' weakness, so the fact that Lothlorien can leverage that a little bit more in conjunction with just the higher damage they do overall in comparison to most factions in the game makes them especially potent in the right sort of situation. You've got to set things up correctly, of course, as is the case with all elven factions, but still definitely worth bearing in mind whether you're playing as Lothlorien or playing against them. And the final thing, we did touch on it briefly when we were talking about Lothlorien's damage dealing potential, but they have varied ranged options in the sense that Mirkwood are the closest neighbours really in terms of who they are, where they are. Mirkwood focus far more on pure archery, whereas Lothlorien, they have that archery option as well, but they blend in a few more things that they have going for them in terms of, particularly the throwing axes, I would say. The fact that they have Bodyguard and rank and file options of throwing axemen means that you're going to be able to deal just that little bit more damage at close to mid-ranges with these projectiles, and it gives you that sort of almost gradient really of damage that you can do before the melee engagement is even joined. And when you combine that with the damage Lorien can do in melee, very often you're going to be working at a numbers deficit as Lothlorien, but you can put a real dent in that before your units ever have to engage in melee if you play your cards right. And this is also down to some specialty projectiles that they have and that they share with the other elves. Again, we'll talk about that when we look at Lothlorien on the open field in a unit by unit basis. But yeah, Lothlorien have got certainly all of those options available to them, and it makes them a pretty versatile faction. The elves do have certain downsides as a universal constant really, but Lothlorien, with their ability to deal damage in these varying ways, It does give them a slightly different flavour to the maybe more defensively minded Imladris or the slightly more guerrilla warfare focused Mirkwood. But speaking of weaknesses, the first one is something which all of the elves share, and it's the most significant one really, and that is that they have expensive units with small unit sizes. This is the sort of thing that you can't really get around when you're playing as the elves. There is, well, I mean, when you're defending in a siege and you have access to a lot of money, you can have an even more quality-centric army, but that isn't going to save you from the fact really that your army is going to be quite small in number. Obviously in a siege you can try and use the map to your advantage, make the battlefield a bit smaller, and when you're in those narrow chokes your quality can be a little bit easier to utilise. But particularly when you're on the attack in a siege, the elves can be difficult to use because very often you have to put yourself in harm's way, and the elves cannot sustain casualties for as long as any other faction in the game really. And it's the trade-off really, especially when you compare them to the orcs of course who are on the other end of the spectrum. They're not going to be able to sustain assaults for as long a period of time. Now on the open field that's the great equaliser really. You know, you're going to have to try and leverage your quality and isolate engagements if you can, and use that damage dealing capability you have at range first and then later on in melee to try and see you over the line. But your staying power in a fight is always going to be called into question. Now you don't have quite the same armour discrepancies that Mirkwood and especially Linden have, but neither are you quite as tanky on an individual basis as Imladris. So you're trading off having maybe a little bit more potency on average across your units when it comes to dealing damage to many different types of targets, but you don't have quite the same ability to sort of wall up and form a bit of a Death Star in the middle of the field like Imladris do with their sheer quality. And sort of baked into that is something that you will notice as Lothlorien as you have a look at some of their units. They do have less shielded options. They're quite similar to Mirkwood in that regard. Their mainline Galathrim units do, but their Bodyguard units, their Cavalry units, their ranged Cavalry unit, and many of their entry-level units in terms of, you know, stuff like the Staff Masters, for example, that we'll talk about later, but many of their mainline Galathrim units are also going to have two-handed weaponry, whether that be an elven curved sword or a two-handed axe. It's not as if they're absent shielded units entirely, but they do have less of an emphasis on that kind of thing than, for example, Imladris. And I think Imladris is probably the best comparison when it comes to their survivability. They are pretty much the halfway house between Imladris and Mirkwood in terms of what their focuses are. A little bit of both from both of those factions, whereas they're a little bit more of an extreme. Linden, perhaps more of an outlier among the elves. You do have those shielded units, you do have good armour as well as Lothlorien, but not quite as much as Imladris, and given the margins that exist when you're trying to win a battle as the elves, these are important distinctions. You won't be able to just stand there and take a bunch of damage from long range indefinitely as Lothlorien, though that won't be quite the same issue as it might be if you're playing as Mirkwood, and certainly if you're playing as Linden. And that brings us on to the final thing that I would mention, and it seems to stick out a little bit more as Lothlorien perhaps than the others, but perhaps that's because the discrepancy is at its largest here, and that's that your entry-level options are pretty flimsy. The armour values on these guys are very low, their shield values are not particularly high. Individually in melee, their melee defense and their higher than average damage will still mean that they do have a part to play, especially if you do need some extra numbers. It's kind of your only option there. But do bear in mind that they aren't going to be able to stay in the fight for too long. They're pretty lightweight, better used as a supporting unit to some of your other options that you have as Lothlorien, perhaps in conjunction with some of your damaging shock troops. It can be a pretty devastating 1-2 because you've got that slightly cheaper entry-level unit with the damage dealing potential of some of your better Galathrim units. But I think it is worth mentioning that if you do send them in as a sort of sacrificial wing of your army, it's not going to go too well for them, and it doesn't tend to. I think because Mirkwood and Linden as a whole have got these issues to them, it doesn't stand out quite so much, and in Imladris you can upgrade the armour of your entry-level units to mitigate that same kind of weakness that they have. But yeah, like I said, it really does seem to stand out a bit more when you're looking at Lorien. But I think now we shall actually go and take a look at what Lothlorien have to offer on the grassy plain, and all of this will become a little bit more clear. So looking at things from here, it is a little bit more numerous than perhaps you would expect, especially in the main body of the army, but there are some armour upgrades to consider when thinking about Mirkwood, or Lothlorien I should say, as infantry. But also this is the entirety of the army, so in comparison to a few other factions, they're not the smallest by any means in terms of roster size, but neither are they the largest, so it is inflated a little bit in spite of the looks of how they are here on the grassy plain. But we'll start off, as we always do, with the basic infantry, the entry levels, and as I mentioned, these guys are a little bit more flimsy perhaps than some other entry-level units from other factions, but they do have their upsides as well. The Lorien Bladesmen being an elven sword and board unit, they're going to have certain things in their favour, and that mainly is going to be the attack score of 11, which is very high for a basic sword and board unit that only costs 450, and also the defensive skill. So when it comes to being in pure melee 1-to-1, they are going to be better than the vast majority of the things that other factions can field at this level, but the main thing with line infantry such as this is that durability and efficiency tends to be what makes them what they are in terms of how much they're worth. The Lorien Bladesmen, as good as they can be in standard 1-to-1 combat, the fact that their armour score is so low at 3 and the shield value is relatively standard at 6 means that they're not going to have the long-range survivability that this kind of unit can often fall back upon. And the fact that they have less men in the unit, standard 133, 134 because of the general, on this occasion means that they can find themselves coming undone if they're used in the same way that other factions use their infantry. I think the key to using these more fragile entry-level elven units, not just for Lorien but certainly for the other ones as well, is going to be recognising their limitations when it comes to taking casualties, whereas other factions like the Orcs, it's actively encouraged. It most certainly is not when it comes to the Elves. Even these units need to be preserved. Expert hiding in woods, that's going to be true of course of many of the Sylvan Elf faction, well, many of the Sylvan Elf units I should say. Moving on, we have the Lorien Spearmen, a little bit more expensive for a single unit at 500, but unlike many other factions, Spearmen, they don't take a unit size nerf when you move over to Spears, though of course that's not saying much considering that the starting point is 133 for all your most basic units, so they are of course a small unit once more. But again, defensive skill reasonably high, the attack is slightly lower at 9, and of course there is the Spear Malus to contend with, but a good bonus fighting cavalry, they can make shield wall. When it comes to, again, fighting 1-to-1 on foot against other infantry units, they're going to be effective as well, albeit more defensively aligned, so many a time you will see the elves fight in defensive sieges, and it's where this kind of unit can honestly be very, very efficient, because it's much harder for the enemy in those situations to be able to take advantage of your more lightweight nature with some of these more entry-level units. But it's when you're on the attack in a siege, and the elves often find this, where their entry-level units, because of how flimsy they are and because of the fact that they do have to march into the firing line, that's where they can be significantly less efficient, but you have kind of no choice but to use them in that way, and they are cheap enough to do so. But if you can use them in their their best way, which is to sort of isolate engagements and be in those more 1-to-1 even fights, that's where the elves can really be very, very efficient indeed. Same armour and shield values though, so again, pretty much the same weaknesses at longer ranges, and also of course the lower unit sizes does mean that mass pushes, even though they do have shield walls, so they're a little bit more well prepared to deal with that sort of thing. They're not going to be able to stop, for example, Great Shield Infantry or Trolls marching through them if they're isolated. And something a little bit more unique to Lothlorien in terms of their more entry-level units, we have the Kerin Amroth Staff Masters, a little bit more expensive again at 600, but they're very much a one-trick pony kind of unit, and you can tell that based upon their stats. I mean, I guess their charge bonus is reasonable, but they have an attack of 1, an armour of 2, and a shield of 0, so obviously terrible stats in those regards. But they have a defensive skill of 30, which is extremely high. Many a Bodyguard unit does not reach heights like that, and that means effectively they're a melee tar pit. It's not too dissimilar to what you would expect to see from the Barrow Wights from a pure melee perspective. The problem that these guys have, of course, is the fact that they don't have the several hit points that the Barrow Wights do, so once again, in a similar vein to the standard Malorn cloak-wearing standard units that Lorien have beside them, they are pretty weak to enemy long-range fire and mid-range fire, so they're going to end up falling away pretty quickly if they get isolated in that regard. They can form Skiltron, so again it's that sort of slightly, that's like curiosity of a formation really. Again, if they fight back to back they can last for a long time, so it's probably at its most useful on a unit like this, honestly, because that's what they're intended to do. The fact they can inspire nearby troops is nice. Again, the elves don't tend to fall into mass routing too easily. If you're falling back upon inspiration effects to keep you in the fight, it's probably not going too well for you, but it's better to have it than not, of course. Hiding anywhere is nice. I mean, Lothlorien have no shortage of units that can do that. Maybe not quite as many as Mirkwood, but enough to the point where you can certainly engage in the same sort of tactics, and the Staff Masters will be one of the main ways to do that. And even though their attack is only 1, it is effective against armour. So against armoured units, you will still be doing that blunt damage to be able to do just that little bit more. It's more useful against more entry-level but armour-focused units. So, for example, your entry-level Orcs or entry-level Western Kingdoms of Men units, where they can do a little bit of damage. If you get into the upper tiers, then the armour piercing is not going to be enough to bolster an attack of 1 to do much of anything, really. But again, a unique kind of unit. And again, situationally can be a real pain to deal with because of those high stats. Now then, moving on to the Galathrim tier, which is going to be certainly where Lothlorien, in terms of their heft, are going to be able to deal a lot of damage. They're still quality focused here. And starting off with the unit that has 3 levels of armour upgrade, they are the cheapest when you don't upgrade the armour, but when you do upgrade it all the way, it brings them more into line with the other Galathrim units, and you'll see why as we go through. Sindar Blade Masters are the two-handed sword option, which, Elven factions, they all have access to a unit like this, to varying levels of expense. The Elder Enway from Ladris, obviously very expensive, maybe a little bit more affordable to use the more lightweight Mithlond Sword Masters from Linden. And at the entry level, that's kind of the best comparison. They can hide anywhere as well, which is nice. The fear-causing effect is also pretty useful, and if you combine that with a good ambush, that can make them very effective. But when you look at the stats, attack of 15, defensive skill of 18, it's what you would expect from an Elven Swordmaster. The base armour of 7 is honestly not terrible, considering how lightweight they look, but that is where you can bolster them pretty significantly when you upgrade the armour. You'll notice these unit models from previous versions of the game, so again you can put the armour up to 8 with 1 level of armour upgrade. And finally, the classic Galathrim look as they're crouching in the slightly taller grass here on the grassy plain is what you get if you fully upgrade the armour. And it bolsters their armour to 9, which is still not as high as you'll get from some of the better Imladris units, but it's certainly better than what you'll see from Mirkwood and Linden. It brings them, more into line with what you would expect from this kind of unit from some of the Western Kingdoms of Men, but the main difference being is they are very dependent on, generally armour and efficiency, whereas the elves are more dependent on their quality. There may only be 133 of them, but when you twin that with the attack of 15, the big defensive skill as well is really going to be in melee, where you're going to be able to chuck out a lot of damage and stay there for a long period of time, provided you're not isolated and caught in a bit of a bad shape of engagement. But being able to hide really does allow you to set up even on the open field a little bit more easily with this kind of unit as a result of that. Now for a pretty significant unit in the Lorien roster, 750 for them, the Galathrim Warriors, and it's the two-handed axe variant really of the Sindar Blade Masters we just looked at. They have actually a slightly higher attack at 16, and when you combine that with the fact that they're effective against armour, they are going to be a deadly unit against any faction that really depends on armour throughout their core units. They're going to be very effective against most of your orcs, most of your men, and of course against the dwarves as well. But the main downside here is they do have slightly less defensive skill. They do come with that armour of 9. 750 puts them in and around the same price as varying levels of the upgrade on the Sindar Blade Masters as well. The fact they can hide anywhere means they can also take advantage of only being deployed to the battle when they're fully needed, which again is very useful on an open field because it means Lothlorien can't be pushed around because of their smaller numbers. However, there are slightly fewer of them, only 123, so there are little trade-offs here and there, but ultimately it just comes down to how armour-centric the force you're facing is, depending on whether you want to go for more Galathrim Warriors or whether you want to go for more Sindar Blade Masters. But the fact that 2 of your mainline units are both shock infantry units, again, gives you an example of how slightly aggressive Lorien are in comparison to a force like Imladris. Also, another kind of a hybrid unit. I was toying with the idea of putting these guys in the ranged units, to be honest, but they are still effectively Lorien's mainline upper end line infantry unit. Galathrim Axemen. 900 is quite a lot, but that's not too alien to the game in terms of a throwing projectile, but also a very strong infantry unit hybrid. A good example of that would be something like the Citadel Guard from Gondor. The Galathrim Axemen are quite similar to that, only with all of the standard elven pluses and minuses. Only 123 once again, so for a line infantry unit, again, the unit size is quite small, but they're a throwing axe unit as well. So that missile attack of 15 means before the battle is even joined, you're going to be able to do a ton of damage. These guys can be especially useful in sieges, especially on the defence as well, because the enemy are going to have to come into range at some point, and either they get into range when the unit is at full health and able to lay down their effectiveness in melee, They have an axe up close and personal as well, so the melee attack is high at 14. They still have that armour of 9, big shield value of 8, defensive skill slightly lower than the two-handers that we saw previously, but still more than enough to be getting on with, especially considering the shield bolsters them in ways that the two-handers cannot have access to. The missile attack is a big deal as well. But 900 is a lot, and it is a small enough unit to the point where you do need to, look after them as well. But that's true of any Elven unit. Caution is warranted when you're playing as any of the Elven factions, and Lorien are no different in that regard, in spite of the fact they are a bit bulkier than their cousins just to the north. But yeah, very, very useful unit. This missile attack of 15, big damage coming from them. And the fact they are one of the first shielded units we've come across as well. Well, in terms of the Galathrim units, the first shielded unit we've come across, it does give them that little bit more rigidity when it comes to trying to ward off enemy projectiles. We did mention that Lorien have less focus on shields in general, and that is certainly true, but the Galathrim axemen can fall back upon that. And also, so too can the most defensively apt unit of their Galathrim tier, and that is the Galathrim spearmen. 800 for them, so slightly less, but then they have far less damage dealing potential than the axemen, but they are, like I said, a little bit more of a defensive bulwark for their army. Of course, they have the bonus fighting cavalry, they can make shield wall, and just in general, their defensive stats are going to be far more impressive than the Lorien spearmen that are on the entry level tier. Attack of 9, it's still subject to the spear malice, but when you combine that with the fact they're going to be staying alive for a long time, if it's just about a melee engagement, they will still add up to do a decent amount of damage, as most Elven spears tend to do. Good total defense as well. The armor once again starts off at 9 for these guys. Defensive skill good enough to keep them alive, but again not as high as the two-handers. Shield value of 8 once again. 800 is slightly less than the axemen. So again, if you're looking to dig into a position in terms of your bulkier units, then the Galathrim spearmen are definitely the way to go because of their ability to outlast many a foe. But do bear in mind, once again, the slightly lower unit size at 123. It is also worth mentioning as well that the two shielded offerings here, as much as they are better at dealing with arrow fire, they don't have access to the ability to hide anywhere like the shock infantry units do, so it's a bit of a trade-off there. But again, that's just the sort of thing that you have to work around, really. They only have one out-and-out bodyguard unit, infantry unit as well. The others are either hybrid units or fully ranged units, depending on how you look at it. And it is also a completely unique bodyguard unit as well, in the sense that it's the only multiple HP unit of pikes that the game has to offer in the Guardians of Karas Galadhon. And I mean, again, in terms of stats, usually pikes have got stats where you look at them and you think they can't be that impressive, but here, actually, the stats are pretty good. The attack of 17 on a unit of pikes is very, very high. Of course, they don't have anything like armor piercing to augment that attack at all, but still, that is a very, very impressive number indeed. And when even the charge bonus of 7 is not too shabby considering they're pikes, but rarely you're going to be charging with pikes. The defensive score as well, the armor of 10 is a little bit higher than even the standard Galathrim units that we were just talking about. Defensive skill of 9 is not amazing, but then no Pike's defensive skill is going to be that good. They're very reliant on their phalanx formation generally, but it's the 2 HP that really set them apart. If they dig into a position where you can't really dislodge them or push through their formation, or you can hit them with arrows even in spite of their armor score, it's going to be a real nightmare to try and deal with. I mean, if it comes down to a last stand where these guys are fully healthy and your army is starting to flag a little bit, it's not going to be good for you. And when you consider, again, inspiration of nearby troops is very nice, and obviously all of the standard other things that pikes have, including a deadly bonus against cavalry. So yeah, unique unit. Obviously the First Legion pikes are the most apt comparison because they're the only pike unit, elite pike unit, to have armor piercing, and it really depends on what you're after, which one is going to be stronger. But when it comes to sheer staying power, there's no doubting the Elven Pike's supremacy there because of that second hit point. You have to kill them twice, and that's even if you can break into their formation in the first place. Now then, Lorien have got access to some strong archers, of course, starting off with the Lorien archers. I mean, they have pretty much the same downsides as the entry-level units of the infantry. The main difference being is the missile attack of 6 is a little bit higher than what you'll find from non-elf factions for an entry-level archer. Their melee score, the defensive skill and melee attack is not terrible, but honestly, they're not going to be as good as most heavier Elven units in melee, so do bear that in mind. As much as Elven archers do tend to be better in melee than their opposition generally, it's not something that you can really depend on with a unit like this. But the armor score being so low and the unit size being so low is the main problem with this. You can't really trade back and forth too efficiently The elves, when it comes to skirmishing with the enemy, their numbers are simply too low unless you really invest in archers, which Lorien can. It just really depends on what you're after. Augmenting your better archers with these is probably what you're going to see more often than not. They're rarely going to be the centre point of elven skirmishing. They're more of a support unit in that regard. 2, units such as this. Heavy elven archers with their multifaceted nature are always going to be a popular one. The Galathrim archers to complete the Galathrim lineup. And you can see again in melee, very, very impressive. Melee attack of 13, good defensive skill. Effectively, they are a slightly worse version of the Sindar Blade Masters in melee. But they also come with the missile attack of 8 and the ability to deal a lot of damage at long range, very long range because they're elves. That obviously, you know, if you can try and control the long range game as the elves and do damage quickly, that's going to be your ticket to success if that's the path you want to go down and really lean heavily on your archery. And the Galathrim archers are going to be pretty vital to you as Lothlorien if you're going to play that way. 800 is quite a lot for a unit that you can't guarantee long range domination with, because again they are a smaller unit. The armour score is good enough to the point where trading back and forth is an option, but whether that's the efficient choice depends on who you're facing off against. Again though, in a siege, a must bring really, because you know late game they can be useful in melee, early game they're going to do a ton of damage to your opposition, attacking or defending. And speaking of doing a lot of damage, the Elven Rangers, Karen Amroth Rangers, we've seen a couple of examples of these guys, the Greenwood Rangers from Mirkwood, the Wardens of Elos Tyrian from Linden, and the Karen Amroth Rangers are no different in the sense that they've got that heightened missile attack that Elven Rangers can fall back upon at 9, very, very damaging. Obviously very long range as well. Good in melee also. The melee attack of 10 and the defensive skill of 13 comes about largely as a result of them having a two-handed blade in melee, so kind of similar to the dual wielders of Mirkwood and Linden, but the Karen Amroths are a little bit more aggressive in that regard, trading a bit more defensive skill in exchange for a little bit more damage. So which is going to be more effective depends pretty heavily on who you're facing and what sort of situation you're in by the time you're committing your rangers to melee. But the main attraction with these guys and any Elven Ranger is always going to be the damage they can deal at extreme long ranges. And as much as they don't have their body piercing anymore, they are still an absolutely vital part of any sort of setup in a siege for whoever can field them. Now then, the central pillar really to most Lothlorien forces, I feel, are going to be these two units, the ranged melee unit hybrids. We'll start off with the Galathrim Nobles, which are similar to units that we've seen before, certainly similar to the Elders of the Elven King. They've got the Silverthorn arrows, which actually make it very difficult to skirmish with them, and also can break up enemy advances with the sort of heavyweight projectiles that they loose. And also the fact that in melee they're also extremely dangerous. Melee attack of 19, defensive skill of 19. You've got the armour of 9, which is not amazing, but it's good enough, certainly. 1400, 2 hit points. You know, they're effectively a two-handed Elven swordsman in melee with a second hit point, but they come with those very high-value projectiles that you would expect from any sort of Elven bodyguard unit. But of course the God Helene from Imladris and the Elders of the Elven King from Mirkwood also share this projectile with Lothlorien, so it's not going to be alien to any sort of Elven force to utilise such a thing. And also, 83 is a pretty decent number, honestly. You know, there are many bodyguard units in the game which have less, but it is worth saying that in spite of the fact that Galathrim Nobles are really strong in melee, because they are a hybrid unit, they don't reach the heights of something like, for example, the Palace Guard from Mirkwood, who are fully melee focused, and as a result their stats are higher. The Nobles do split their attentions, which give them more versatility, but it also means they're less focused, and while they can hold their own in melee, they're not going to be quite as domineering as some of the other Elven units up close. You could say the same about the God Helene and the Elders as well. So do bear that in mind, but still a very, very good unit all round. And a unit that did get changed in this version of the game. There used to be another archer unit, which was a little bit weird. They had 2 bodyguard archers, but now the Kindred of Caliborn, you can actually see them in their old guise in the picture there. They are a throwing axe unit, which gives them a little bit more versatility when it comes to their bodyguard units. I would say that the Kindred as well, because of Lothlorien's slightly more aggressive approach up close, having a bodyguard throwing axe unit can really help sort of hammer that home and help them deal a huge amount of damage at close range. They have the inspiration and the fear effects as well. They're a dual wielder, which does mean that, I mean, melee attack of 20, missile attack of 20, huge damage off those throwing axes, still 83 of them. Total defense of 40, I mean, you can see that in action there because of their dual wielding nature. 29, huge, no shield of course, but good armour. All in all, You know, I think the Silver Thorns do mean that if you bring the Galathrim Nobles, you've got a little bit more long range. They're a little bit easier to use. But I do think if you're looking for a ceiling on a unit, I think the Kindred's ceiling is a little bit higher, if I'm honest, because of the damage they can kick out, and because I think they really do complement a lot of the other Lorien units quite well. Kind of a finisher unit, really, when you combine them with the other throwing axes that you've got in your main line. You know, you can end up doing a huge amount of damage to your opposition at long ranges, and then to escape that, they'll try and close up on you. But they're going to continue taking damage then from your throwing axes, so by the time they get to melee, all of a sudden the numbers discrepancy that you're likely to be facing as Lothlorien will probably look a little bit less daunting. 1300, pretty good price again, 83. So for a bodyguard unit, they're actually fairly numerous. It's probably one of the only times you'll see that mentioned when in regards to the elves, because their mainline units are significantly smaller. But 83 is, you know, sort of the upper end of the numbers you can expect to have in a bodyguard tier unit, and for one as good as this, and for one as, you know, easy to use, I would say, as the Galathrim Nobles, that is a pretty good deal that you're getting as the elves. It's a bit of a rarity, so you've got to take them where they come. Cavalry, for example, Lorien do have access to some decent cavalry for what they are, but they can't field them in the same sort of numbers that other more cavalry-centric factions can. The Lothlorien cavalry, we saw them to good effect in tournaments in days gone by. 800 is kind of par for the course for this kind of unit. Again, this cavalry is an area where the elves don't tend to have a huge step up in cost and numbers reduction in comparison to some other factions, so they do have that going for them. But still, it can be a little bit difficult to utilise them against well-prepared cavalry forces, because they don't have any sort of bonus against cavalry. They are purely anti-infantry, really, in terms of their focus. Hit and run, shock cav, 63 of them. You know, decent defences as well. I mean, they've got a good shield, they've got good defensive skill to at least escape if they can sort of wriggle free of enemy cav, and also the armour is good, as you would expect from Galathrim level units. But yeah, very much that hit and run style of cav, unsurprisingly. And then just in behind, we have another bodyguard option, this being the mounted version of the Galathrim Nobles, these being the Galathrim Riders. Certainly in the running for the best horse archer unit in the game, depending upon what you're after. You can see here that, again, they do have the inspiration effect on them, but again, on cavalry, we've already mentioned with pretty much every faction overview video where there is a high tier cavalry unit that has it, the usefulness can vary pretty heavily. They are strong up close as well. They don't have any listed bonus against cavalry in melee, but the melee attack of 17 is very, very high, and the defensive skill of 17 is also high enough with that two-handed blade of theirs, to the point where they can just get by on their baseline stats, which is kind of true of elves in general if they're left one-to-one. You know, they may not have bonus damages that some other forces have. You can look to, you know, for example, in this case, I suppose, like, you know, we're looking more, I was going to say armor piercing, but that's not really true of Lothlorien. But yeah, they don't depend upon these bonus damages to be efficient, as long as the engagement is not too uncomfortable for them, and I would say that's true of the Galathrim Riders when it comes to trading back and forth with enemy cavalry up close, but you definitely want to be using their Silverthorn arrows first and foremost. Speedy across the field, missile attack of 8 with those high damage projectiles, high mass projectiles as well. 1400 is a lot, but they're a little bit easier to babysit because of their speed, and of course the second hit point means that they aren't the easiest to take down either. And finally, as has been the case with every Elven faction we've talked about, the only artillery piece they have access to is the standard ballista, but we have seen how good this can be on the open field in particular, and it can help make up for some of the Elven issues when it comes to manpower on their archer line. If you twin it with the ballista, they can become a surprisingly difficult faction to overwhelm at long ranges, as long as you gain artillery superiority, which is a big deal. So there is a certain risk to it, but it has been worthwhile time and time again. And of course, in a siege, artillery can be the making or the breaking of you, albeit a ballista is a little bit more easy to plan for than some of the other artillery pieces that are on offer. So in many ways, the elves, you know, it's a little bit low risk, but you know, lower reward, but it's a lower risk. And I think for artillery, from an elven perspective, that's probably for the best, because they already take higher risks with quality and army sizes and compositions elsewhere. So having something a little bit more dependable you can fall back on in an area where other factions maybe don't, is probably the right path forward, not only for Lorien, but also for the other elves, as we've spoken about in the past. So there we have it. The final Elven faction to talk about in the faction overview series has been wrapped up. Lorien, the damaging ones. I would say that, you know, Lorien, I've always had a bit of a soft spot for them. They were in a little bit of a strange spot a couple of patches ago, you know, where they didn't really have too much of a defined identity, because Imladris were better defensively and Mirkwood had the better skirmishers and better damage dealing options, but now Lorien a little bit more of an aggressive force, and you know the throwing axes add a lot to them in that regard, I would suggest. But also geographically, it does also mean that we've kind of cut ourselves off. There's no obvious path to follow through Middle-earth now. So, bit of a curveball, we're going to go as far east as we can possibly go now to really the last of the sort of non-Numenorian human kingdoms that we've got to look at. And it's also one of the ones that, you know, is sort of most mysterious, most left to the reader's imagination, I would suppose, in terms of what this land actually contains. Next up, we'll be talking about the Variags of Khand. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for that.